The morning mist clings to the Blue Ridge Mountains as sunlight breaks across 4 acres of limestone facade. 250 rooms wait behind those walls. 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, a bowling alley in the basement, an indoor swimming pool lined with pale brick, a library that holds 23,000 volumes. The numbers accumulate like interest on a debt that can never be fully paid. George Washington Vanderbilt II stood 5 feet, 9 inches tall, and weighed 130 pounds. He had pale skin, dark hair, and eyes that photographers described as melancholic. When he died in 1914, newspapers called him the last of the Medici. The comparison wasn't meant as praise. By then, everyone understood what Medici meant. It meant money spent on beauty, while the world outside the gates was changing in ways that beauty couldn't stop. The Vanderbilt fortune began with a ferry. Cornelius Vanderbilt, George's grandfather, operated a small boat between Staten Island and Manhattan in 1810. He charged 18 cents per passenger. Within 10 years, he owned a fleet. Within 20, he controlled steamship routes up and down the East Coast. At 56, he sold his maritime empire for $11 million and bought railroads. When he died in 1877, his estate was worth $105 million. That's approximately $3 billion in 2026 currency. His son, William, doubled it. William's youngest son, George, inherited $10 million at age 22. George didn't want railroads. He wanted books. He spoke 8 languages fluently. He collected first editions, medieval manuscripts, illuminated prayer books. He commissioned bronze statues and marble fountains. He bought entire rooms from European estates and had them dismantled, crated, shipped across the Atlantic. While his brothers built summer cottages in Newport with 30 rooms, George traveled through the Appalachian Mountains looking for something else. He found it in 1888. The property comprised 125,000 acres. Previous owners had logged it aggressively. The slopes were bare. Erosion had carved gullies through the red clay. Local farmers called it scrubland. George saw topography. He saw the way morning light collected in the valleys. He saw elevation changes that created natural amphitheaters. He saw water sources, south-facing slopes, protected hollows. He hired Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. Pinchot walked the property for 3 months. His report ran to 87 pages. The core recommendation appeared on page 4. The land needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Frederick Law Olmsted arrived in February 1889. He was 66 years old. He had designed Central Park, Prospect Park, the grounds of the U.S. Capitol. He had pioneered the concept of the park system, the idea that green space in cities wasn't luxury, but necessity. When he saw the Vanderbilt property, he tried to talk George out of building anything. The soil was depleted. The timber was gone. The slopes were too steep for conventional landscaping. Olmsted recommended selling it and buying property on the Carolina coast instead. George said no. Olmsted returned to the hotel room he'd rented in Asheville and designed what would become the most extensive private landscape project in American history. The plan required 90,000 cubic yards of earth to be moved. 3 miles of private road had to be carved through forest. A nursery had to be established on site to grow the 1 million plants Olmsted specified. These weren't decorative plantings. Olmsted designed the landscape as a working system. White pines to stabilize slopes, hemlock for erosion control, rhododendron for ground cover, oak and chestnut for canopy. Each species served a function. Beauty was the byproduct of ecological restoration. The approach road alone took 2 years to complete. Olmsted routed it through forest, across streams, past carefully planned sight lines that revealed the house gradually. Visitors approaching wouldn't see the full structure until the final curve. The effect was choreographed. The mansion would appear all at once, complete and inevitable, as though it had always existed in that exact location. Richard Morris Hunt received the commission in June 1889. He was 62. He had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had designed the base of the Statue of Liberty, the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, marble palaces for the Astors and the Guillets. When George showed him sketches of Loire Valley Chateau, Hunt recognized immediately what George wanted, not a copy, a translation. The chateau at Blois provided the model for the exterior stonework. The chateau at Chenonceau inspired the grand staircase. The chateau at Chambord influenced the roofline. Hunt combined elements from 16 different structures and integrated them so completely that architectural historians would later struggle to identify the sources. The result looked French, but it was something else. It was American money interpreting European history through the filter of industrial age ambition. Construction began in 1889. The main house required 1,000 workers at peak. Craftsmen came from Italy to carve the limestone. Stonemasons came from Scotland to lay the foundation. Woodworkers came from Austria to install the paneling. A brick factory was built on site to manufacture the 10 million bricks the structure required. A limestone quarry was opened 8 miles away. A private railway spur was constructed to transport materials. The workforce lived in a temporary village at the base of the property. They had their own post office, general store, physician. The village had electricity before the town of Asheville did. George visited the site monthly. He brought architects from New York to consult on the library. He brought lighting designers from Paris to plan the chandeliers. He brought botanical experts from Kew Gardens to advise on the conservatory. Every detail received attention. The banquet hall ceiling rose 70 feet. The fireplace in that room stood 12 feet tall and burned logs 8 feet long. 3 men were employed full-time just to maintain the fireplaces. The costs accumulated in ways that surprised even George. The initial budget of $1.5 million doubled by 1892. It doubled again by 1894. Olmsted's landscaping alone cost $700,000. The furniture and artwork added another $800,000. The organ in the banquet hall cost $10,000. The limestone facade cost $650,000. By the time the house opened for Christmas 1895, George had spent $6 million. That's approximately $200 million in 2020 currency. The property wasn't finished. The grounds were still being planted. The approach road needed additional work. The conservatory was incomplete, but the house itself was ready. George invited family members to spend the holiday season. His mother came from New York. His brothers arrived with their wives. The guest list numbered 57 people. They ate Christmas dinner in the banquet hall under electric lights. Edison himself had designed the system. The house had its own power plant, its own water filtration system, its own fire suppression equipment. It was entirely self-sufficient, a sealed environment where temperature, humidity, and light could be controlled regardless of conditions outside. Edith Stuyvesant Dresser met George in Paris in 1897. She was 24. He was 35. She came from old New York money. Her father had died when she was young. Her mother had raised her and her siblings in respectable poverty, the kind where you wore last season's dresses and attended the right parties. Edith spoke fluent French. She painted watercolors. She had traveled extensively through Europe with her mother and sisters. She found George serious, thoughtful, entirely different from the railroad magnates and industrialists her family usually socialized with. They were married in Paris in June 1898. The ceremony was small. George's family didn't attend. Edith wore a dress made in Paris. They honeymooned in England, then returned to Biltmore in August. The estate employed 80 people inside the house. Another 40 worked in the gardens. 60 more maintained the farm operations George had established on the property. He had built a dairy barn that housed 30 Jersey cows. He had constructed a poultry house for 500 chickens. He had planted orchards and vineyards. The farms were experimental. George wanted to demonstrate that scientific agriculture could rehabilitate depleted land. He imported breeding stock from Europe. He hired agricultural scientists to manage crop rotation. He brought in forestry experts to oversee the reforestation of logged slopes. The farms lost money every year. George didn't care. He viewed them as demonstration projects. Local farmers could visit and learn techniques. The Extension Service used Biltmore as a teaching facility. George believed wealth created obligations. Beauty wasn't enough. The estate had to serve a purpose beyond his own pleasure. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born in August 1900. She was the only child George and Edith would have. Photographs show a small girl with dark hair and serious eyes, always formally dressed, always positioned slightly apart from the adults around her. She grew up in a house where she could get lost for days. Servants appeared when summoned. Food arrived at precise times. Tutors came from New York to teach her languages, mathematics, history. She had a pony, a series of dogs, unlimited access to her father's library. She spent hours in the library. It was her favorite room. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held books in English, French, German, Italian, Spanish. The ceiling was painted to look like the night sky. George had commissioned it from an artist in New York. It showed the constellations as they appeared over Asheville on the night Cornelia was born. She would lie on the floor and stare up at it, trying to find patterns in the painted stars. George's health began declining in 1912. He developed complications from what doctors called exhaustion. He had never been physically robust. The management of Biltmore required constant attention. The farms, the forests, the house itself, the grounds. Every system needed oversight. Every project required decisions. He traveled frequently to New York for medical consultations. Specialists recommended rest. George couldn't rest. There was too much to oversee. Edith began taking over daily management. She met with the estate superintendent each morning. She reviewed accounts, approved purchases, managed staff. George spent more time in the library. He was 48 years old. He looked 60. On March 6, 1914, he underwent surgery for complications related to appendicitis. He died during the procedure. The cause of death was listed as peritonitis. He was buried in the family mausoleum on Staten Island. The funeral service was private. Only family attended. Edith inherited everything, the estate, the property, the debt, because there was debt. George's fortune, substantial as it had been, couldn't sustain Biltmore indefinitely. The annual operating costs exceeded $400,000. That included staff salaries, maintenance, property taxes, farm operations. The property taxes alone were $60,000 per year. Income from the farms covered roughly 30% of operating costs. The forests were finally mature enough to harvest, but sustainable forestry generated modest returns. Edith needed to find new revenue sources or sell the property. She chose neither option. Instead, she began dismantling pieces of the estate. In 1916, Edith sold 87,000 acres to the federal government for $5 per acre. That property became the core of Pisgah National Forest. The sale generated $435,000. It covered 2 years of operating expenses. Edith retained the house and 5,000 acres of surrounding land. She closed sections of the house. The guest rooms on the 3rd floor were shuttered. The swimming pool was drained. Staff was reduced from 80 to 42. The farms were consolidated. The dairy operation was sold to a local cooperative. The orchards were leased to tenant farmers. Edith focused on the core property, the house, the gardens, the immediate grounds. She wanted Cornelia to inherit something that could be maintained. Cornelia married John Francis Amherst Cecil in April 1924. She was 23. He was 30, the younger son of a British nobleman. They had met in Washington, D.C. at a diplomatic reception. He was charming, educated, entirely unsuitable by the standards of New York society. British younger sons didn't inherit titles or estates. They lived on allowances and made strategic marriages. Edith approved the match anyway. She liked John. He was thoughtful, interested in agriculture, willing to work. The wedding took place at All Souls Church in Biltmore Village. 800 guests attended. The reception was held at the house. It was the last major social event Biltmore would host for decades. The 1929 stock market crash destroyed what remained of the Vanderbilt fortune. Edith lost 70% of her invested capital. The trust funds that had generated income dried up. She faced a choice: sell the estate or find a way to make it generate revenue. John suggested opening the house to tourists. Edith resisted. The idea of strangers walking through her home seemed impossible. But the property taxes were due. Staff salaries had to be paid. In March 1930, Biltmore opened for public tours. Admission was $2. Visitors were allowed in the first floor only, no photographs, no touching. A guide led groups of 20 through the reception rooms, the banquet hall, the library. The house attracted 32,000 visitors the first year. It generated $64,000 in admission fees. That covered half the annual operating costs. World War II brought new complications. Staff left for military service. Materials for maintenance became unavailable. The government requisitioned copper from the roof for munitions. Edith considered closing the house entirely. Tourism had dropped to almost nothing. Gasoline rationing made travel impossible. But she kept the house open anyway, offering free admission to military personnel stationed nearby. Soldiers came by the hundreds. They walked through rooms furnished with Renaissance tapestries and French antiques, touching nothing, speaking in whispers, clearly overwhelmed by the scale and opulence. Many of them wrote letters to Edith afterward, thanking her for the glimpse of a world they would never otherwise have seen. She kept every letter. They were stored in boxes in a 3rd-floor bedroom, never cataloged, never published, slowly yellowing in the mountain humidity. Edith died in December 1958. She was 84 years old. She had managed the estate for 44 years. Cornelia inherited the property, but chose not to live there. She had divorced John Cecil in 1934 and moved to England. Her 2 sons, George and William Cecil, inherited Biltmore jointly. Neither had lived there since childhood. They faced the same question Edith had confronted in 1914: sell or sustain. The old house needed extensive repairs. The roof leaked. The heating system was failing. The electrical wiring was 60 years old and dangerous. The estimated cost of basic maintenance was $800,000. Neither brother had that kind of capital. William Cecil moved to Asheville in 1960. He was 35 years old. He had been working in banking in New York. He had no experience in tourism or property management. He walked through the house room by room, cataloging what needed to be done. The wallpaper was peeling, plaster was cracking, windows were drafty, floors were warped. The task was overwhelming, but William was methodical. He created a prioritized list: roof first, then heating, then plumbing, then electrical, then cosmetic repairs. He took out loans using the property as collateral. He hired contractors. Work began in 1961 and continued for 5 years. The total cost exceeded $2 million. The house reopened in 1966 with expanded touring hours and a new admission structure. Visitors could now access the second floor. A restaurant was added in the former stable building. A gift shop opened in what had been the estate office. Admission increased to $4. The changes worked. Annual visitors climbed to 180,000. Revenue covered operating costs for the first time since the 1920s. William reinvested profits into restoration. The conservatory was rebuilt. The gardens were replanted according to Olmsted's original plans. The bowling alley in the basement was restored. The indoor swimming pool, dry since 1920, was renovated and filled. William died in 2017. His son, Bill Cecil Jr., inherited management responsibility. By then, Biltmore had become a complex business operation. The house attracted 1.5 million visitors annually. Admission had risen to $75. The estate operated hotels on the property, a winery, restaurants, retail shops. Annual revenue exceeded $200 million. The property employed 2,000 people. It was the largest employer in Asheville. None of this would have been recognizable to George Vanderbilt. He had built Biltmore as a private retreat, a place where he could escape New York society and focus on his books and his land restoration projects. Now, his bedroom was on the tour route. Strangers stood in his library and took photographs. His dining table, where he had eaten quiet meals with Edith and Cornelia, was roped off behind velvet barriers. The house had become exactly what he never intended it to be, a spectacle. The library still holds 23,000 volumes. Most are original to George's collection. The books are too fragile to be handled. They sit behind glass now, arranged according to the system George established in 1895. First editions of Dickens, Thackeray, Balzac, illuminated manuscripts from medieval monasteries, leather-bound volumes from the 16th century, their pages hand-cut and gilt-edged. George had read extensively from this collection. Marginalia in his handwriting fills many volumes. Notes, questions, responses to arguments made by long-dead authors. No one reads these notes anymore. They're too valuable to risk damage. The books have been cataloged, appraised, insured. They're inventory now. The tour route takes 90 minutes. Guides lead groups through the first and second floors. They point out architectural details, explain the function of various rooms, share anecdotes about the family. George's love of books, Edith's management after his death, Cornelia's unconventional marriage. The narrative has been refined through repetition. Guides know which stories resonate with visitors. They know when to pause for photographs. They know how to move groups through quickly enough to maintain the schedule while giving the impression of unhurried exploration. It's choreography. Olmsted would have understood. He designed the approach road to create a specific experience. The tour guides design the interior route for the same reason. Control what people see, and you control what they feel. The house contains original furnishings in every public room. The bed in the Louis XV bedroom came from a palace outside Paris. The tapestries in the banquet hall were woven in the 16th century. The chandelier in the breakfast room holds 72 candles and weighs 400 pounds. These objects have been appraised at values that are not disclosed publicly. Insurance companies require security systems, environmental controls, fire suppression equipment. The objects are monitored constantly. Temperature, humidity, light exposure. The furniture is rotated periodically to prevent uneven fading. Tapestries are inspected quarterly for moth damage. The house isn't a home. It's a museum pretending to be a home, or possibly a home pretending to be a museum. The distinction has become meaningless. Visitors often ask why the family doesn't live in a house anymore. Guides explain that the family maintains private residences on the property. They don't specify where. The question reveals a fundamental misunderstanding. Houses like Biltmore weren't designed for living in the way people think of living now. They were designed for display. The reception rooms, the formal dining room, the banquet hall, these spaces existed to impress visitors. The family's actual living happened in smaller rooms that aren't on the tour route. George's personal study, Edith's morning room, Cornelia's bedroom. These spaces were comfortable, human-scaled, unimpressive, but they don't generate revenue. Tourists pay to see grandeur, not intimacy. The estate has survived through adaptation. After George's death, Edith adapted by reducing scale. After the Depression, Cornelia's family adapted by opening to tourists. After William's death, Bill Jr. adapted by expanding commercial operations. The house has remained in family ownership for 130 years because each generation has been willing to compromise George's original vision. He wanted a private sanctuary. His descendants have created a public attraction. The transformation wasn't cynical, it was necessary. Houses like Biltmore can't exist as private residences anymore. The costs are too high. The property taxes are too steep. The maintenance requirements are too demanding. Survival means transformation. The Great Recession of 2008 threatened the estate's financial stability. Tourism dropped 40%. Revenue fell below projections for the first time in decades. The family considered selling portions of the land to developers. Instead, they secured loans and reduced operating expenses. Staff was cut, maintenance was deferred, marketing budgets were slashed. The family weathered the crisis by accepting lower profits and reinvesting less in restoration. The strategy worked. By 2012, tourism had recovered, but the episode revealed the fundamental fragility of the operation. Biltmore survives because it attracts visitors. If tourism declines permanently, the house can't sustain itself. The endowment isn't large enough. The commercial operations aren't profitable enough. The entire structure depends on public interest remaining steady. Conservationists study Biltmore as a model for sustainable private preservation. The house hasn't been donated to the National Park Service. It hasn't been converted into a hotel. It remains privately owned and operated. This arrangement is unusual. Most comparable properties have been transferred to public entities or non-profit organizations. The Vanderbilt family has chosen a different path. They've maintained ownership by creating a business model that generates sufficient revenue to cover costs and modest profits. The model requires constant adaptation. Tourism trends change. Visitor expectations evolve. Economic conditions fluctuate. The family has to anticipate these changes and adjust operations accordingly. It's active management, not passive stewardship. The property includes 8,000 acres of forest. These forests are managed according to principles Gifford Pinchot established in 1891: selective harvesting, natural regeneration, diverse species composition. The forests generate modest income from timber sales. More importantly, they provide ecological services, water filtration, carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat. Olmsted and Pinchot understood that land restoration wasn't just aesthetic, it was functional. The forests they planted stabilized eroded slopes, filtered runoff, and created conditions that allowed native species to return. This work continued for decades after both men died. It continues now. Foresters walk the property regularly, marking trees for harvest, monitoring regeneration, managing deer populations. The work is invisible to most visitors. They see beautiful forests. They don't see the management that maintains those forests. George's vision for Biltmore included demonstrating sustainable land management practices. He wanted to prove that scientific forestry could rehabilitate damaged land. He wanted to show that agriculture could be profitable without depleting soil. These goals seem modest now. Every farmer understands crop rotation. Every forester knows about selective harvesting. But in 1889, these practices were novel. American forestry was extraction-based. Loggers clear-cut slopes and moved on. Farmers exhausted soil and abandoned fields. George's approach was different. He invested in restoration before seeking returns. He accepted short-term losses for long-term sustainability. This philosophy seems obvious from a 21st century perspective. In 1889, it was radical. The house tour doesn't discuss ecological restoration. It focuses on the family story, the architectural details, the art collection. Guides don't explain Olmsted's landscape design principles or Pinchot's forestry innovations. These subjects don't interest most visitors. They want to see the bedrooms, the kitchens, the bowling alley. They want to imagine what life was like for the Vanderbilts. The tours provide that experience. They don't provide context about the agricultural and forestry experiments that George considered central to his project. Those stories have been edited out. They're too technical. They slow down the narrative. They don't photograph well. Cornelia never wrote about her childhood at Biltmore. She gave no interviews. She left no diary. What's known about her early life comes from letters between Edith and family members, from household records, from photographs. She appears in these sources as a solitary child, often alone in large rooms, always formally dressed, rarely smiling. After her divorce from John Cecil in 1934, she left the United States and rarely returned. She lived in London, then Switzerland, then back to England. She maintained contact with her sons but saw them infrequently. She died in 1976 in England. She was 75. Her obituary in the New York Times ran 4 paragraphs. It mentioned her father's fortune and her mother's management of Biltmore. It didn't mention what Cornelia thought about any of it. The bedroom where Cornelia grew up is on the second floor tour route. It overlooks the mountains. The furniture is original. The wallpaper has been restored according to period photographs. The room looks exactly as it did in 1910. Guides tell visitors that Cornelia loved horses and spent hours riding through the forests. This is true. Household records document riding lessons, stable expenses, veterinary visits for her pony. What the guides don't mention is that Cornelia left Biltmore as soon as she legally could. She married at 23 and moved away. She returned only for obligatory visits. After Edith's death, she never came back. The bedroom, preserved so carefully, memorializes a childhood that Cornelia apparently wanted to escape. The servants who maintained Biltmore left almost no records. They weren't famous. They didn't write memoirs. Household account books document their wages. Staff rosters show names and positions, but their actual experiences, their thoughts about working in such an unusual place, aren't preserved. What's known comes from census records and local newspaper archives. Most staff lived in Biltmore Village. They walked to work each morning. They worked 6-day weeks. They received Christmas bonuses and 2 weeks of paid vacation. These were generous benefits for the period. The wages were competitive. Positions at Biltmore were sought after. But whether the staff enjoyed working there, whether they felt the work was meaningful, whether they resented serving people who could afford such excess, these questions can't be answered. The historical record is silent. The estate's relationship with Asheville has always been complicated. George's arrival brought construction jobs and economic activity. Local suppliers provided materials. Local workers built roads and planted forests. But the property paid minimal taxes because George successfully argued it was agricultural land, not developed real estate. This arrangement generated resentment. Asheville provided services, roads, fire protection, law enforcement, but Biltmore contributed little to the tax base. The situation improved after 1930 when the house opened to tourists. Visitors spent money in Asheville hotels and restaurants. The city benefited indirectly from Biltmore's attraction, but tensions persisted. The estate was private. The forests were closed to public access. Local residents couldn't use the land their ancestors had hunted and foraged on. The Cecil family maintained the boundaries. Trespassing was prosecuted. The message was clear. This property belongs to us. You're welcome to visit if you pay admission. Otherwise, stay out. Contemporary debates about inherited wealth inevitably reference families like the Vanderbilts. The railroad fortune that built Biltmore came from monopolistic business practices. Cornelius Vanderbilt broke competitors through price wars and strategic route acquisitions. He corrupted politicians. He manipulated markets. His business methods were legal but ruthless. His descendants spent that fortune on houses and art and lavish lifestyles. They didn't create the wealth. They inherited it. George Vanderbilt never worked in any conventional sense. He managed his investments and pursued his interests. He was thoughtful, cultured, generous by the standards of his class. But his ability to build Biltmore came entirely from wealth he had no role in creating. This fact complicates any assessment of his legacy. The house is beautiful. The land restoration was environmentally progressive. But the money that made it all possible came from a system that enriched a few through the exploitation of many. The tour guides don't discuss wealth inequality. They don't explain the Gilded Age economy that made fortunes like the Vanderbilts possible. These subjects aren't appropriate for a house tour. Visitors come for architecture and history, not economic critique. The Cecil family is conscious of these sensitivities. Marketing materials emphasize George's land stewardship and Edith's management skills. They present the family as responsible custodians of an important cultural resource. The narrative is carefully constructed. It acknowledges privilege while emphasizing hard work. It recognizes good fortune while highlighting personal sacrifice. The balance is delicate. The family needs public goodwill. Biltmore survives because people choose to visit. If the public perception shifts, if the house comes to symbolize inequality rather than beauty, attendance will decline. The Cecil family understands this. They manage not just a property, but a reputation. Preservation professionals study Biltmore as an example of successful adaptive reuse. The house has remained intact and in family ownership. while generating sufficient revenue to fund maintenance and restoration. This outcome is rare. Most comparable properties have been demolished, subdivided, or transferred to institutional ownership. The Vanderbilt family has avoided these fates through careful financial management and willingness to transform a private residence into a commercial operation. The transformation has required compromises. Public access means wear on historic interiors. Commercial operations mean modern infrastructure on a historic site. Marketing requirements mean emphasizing certain aspects of the property's history while downplaying others. But these compromises have enabled preservation. Without tourism revenue, Biltmore would have been sold decades ago. The house would have been demolished or converted to institutional use. Instead, it survives largely intact, a monument to wealth, ambition, and the peculiar American belief that private beauty serves a public good. The estate generates approximately $250 million in annual revenue from all operations. Admission fees account for roughly 40%. Hotels and restaurants generate 30%. The winery contributes 20%. Retail and other activities make up the remainder. Operating expenses consume approximately 70% of revenue. Property taxes, now paid in full, take $5 million annually. Staff salaries cost $40 million. Maintenance and utilities require $30 million. Insurance premiums are steep. Marketing budgets are substantial. After expenses, the family realizes profit margins of 20 to 30%. These profits are reinvested in restoration, expansion, and debt service. The Cecil family has borrowed extensively to fund capital improvements. The winery required a $20 million investment. A new hotel cost $60 million. These investments increase revenue potential but also increase financial risk. If tourism declines, the debt service becomes problematic. The estate's financial structure is sophisticated but fragile. It works as long as growth continues. If growth stalls, the model fails. The library's ceiling still shows stars painted to match the night sky on August 22, 1900, Cornelia's birth. The artist who created it came from New York and worked for 3 months. He used astronomical charts to ensure accuracy. The constellations are correct down to individual stars. Visitors pass through the library quickly now. The room is on the tour route, but not emphasized. Guides spend more time in the bedrooms where stories about the family are easier to tell. The ceiling goes unnoticed. Most visitors don't look up. They focus on the furniture, the books behind glass, the photographs of George working at his desk. The stars fade slowly. Paint deteriorates. Temperature and humidity cycles cause expansion and contraction. Eventually, the ceiling will need restoration. Conservators will study the original artist's techniques. They'll match pigments. They'll repair cracks. They'll preserve the constellation pattern exactly as it was painted in 1901. The work will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It will be invisible to most visitors, but it will be done because that's what preservation requires: constant attention, continual investment, acceptance that nothing lasts without effort. George Vanderbilt visited Europe 23 times between 1880 and 1913. He bought art, furniture, architectural elements. He shipped hundreds of crates back to New York, then to Biltmore. The collection he assembled was meant to educate as well as decorate. He wanted visitors to his home to see great art, to understand artistic traditions, to appreciate craftsmanship. This vision was paternalistic but sincere. George believed exposure to beauty improved people. He believed art was morally instructive. These ideas seem quaint now, but they shaped Biltmore. The house was designed as a teaching tool, a demonstration that wealth could be deployed for cultural elevation. The irony is that the house now teaches a different lesson. It teaches about wealth itself, about the resources required to create such a place, about the labor that maintains it, about the compromises necessary to preserve it. Visitors leave Biltmore understanding something about excess. Whether that understanding includes admiration or critique depends on the visitor. The approach road still follows Olmsted's original route, 3 miles through forest, carefully planned sight lines. The mansion appears suddenly around the final curve. The effect still works. Visitors in cars experience the same reveal that visitors in carriages experienced in 1895. The road required 2 years to build. Workers carved it through hillsides, bridged streams, removed trees and stumps and boulders. The grade was calculated precisely, steep enough to create drama, gentle enough for horses. The engineering was sophisticated. Drainage systems prevented erosion, retaining walls stabilized slopes. The road was built to last. It has lasted. It's been repaved multiple times. The surface is asphalt now, not crushed stone, but the route is unchanged. Olmsted's design principles were sound. The approach still creates anticipation. The forest still conceals. The mansion still surprises. This is landscape architecture working as intended. The visitor's experience is shaped before they reach the house. Expectations are established. Emotional responses are primed. The house delivers on promises the landscape makes. Estate management has become increasingly professionalized. The Cecil family employs specialists in tourism management, hotel operations, restaurant services, event planning, wine production, retail operations. These professionals bring expertise from outside industries. They implement best practices. They analyze data. They optimize operations. This approach is necessary. Biltmore competes with theme parks and resort destinations. Visitor expectations have increased. Simply showing people historic rooms isn't enough anymore. The estate has to provide comprehensive experiences. Hence, the hotels, restaurant, winery tours, special events. Each addition serves a strategic purpose. Hotels extend visit duration and capture additional spending. Restaurants prevent visitors from leaving the property for meals. The winery creates a distinct brand identity. Special events generate revenue during slow seasons. Every decision is analyzed for financial impact. George would have recognized none of this. He built Biltmore as a personal retreat. It has become a carefully managed commercial enterprise. Climate change threatens the property in ways that are difficult to manage. Temperature increases stress historic materials. Humidity fluctuations damage wood and textiles. Extreme weather events damage infrastructure. The forests face new pressures from invasive species and shifting growing conditions. Estate foresters monitor these changes closely. They adjust management plans. They select drought-resistant species for replanting. They manage for climate resilience. But the challenges are systemic. The house was built for a climate that no longer exists. The forests were planted based on assumptions that are no longer valid. Adaptation is possible, but expensive. Historic preservation in an era of environmental change requires constant intervention. Nothing can simply be maintained. Everything must be actively managed against deteriorating conditions. This reality doesn't appear in marketing materials. Visitors don't see the infrastructure that controls humidity in the house. They don't see the work that maintains forest health. They see beauty. The effort that creates that beauty is invisible. The house remains as George designed it. 250 rooms, 4 acres of floor space, 65 fireplaces. The numbers haven't changed, but the meaning has. The house was built as a statement. George wanted to demonstrate that American wealth could create European-style cultural institutions. He wanted to show that money earned through railroads could support artistic and intellectual pursuits. He wanted legitimacy. The house was his argument. Look what we can build. Look what we can preserve. Look what we can contribute to civilization. The argument was always complicated. Beautiful buildings don't justify exploitative business practices. Art collections don't erase economic inequality. But George believed in the value of cultural institutions. He believed great houses inspired people. Whether he was right is open to debate. What isn't debatable is that Biltmore survives, despite costs, despite changing social values, despite economic pressures. The house stands, the forests grow, visitors come, the property continues, not as George imagined, but in ways he might recognize, as a place that asks questions about beauty, wealth, permanence, and purpose. The questions haven't changed. The answers keep evolving.